For this one, we're going to talk about some tips and tricks for implementing Zero Trust. The first thing you want to do is you want to establish that architecture. Like you spoke about, everyone has best practices in the cloud. It's the same thing true for on-premise. When you're thinking about a Zero Trust architecture, there are best practices. So that's why we use the NIST and CISA Zero Trust models to think about an architecture. You want to establish that architecture as your foundation and then build up from there.
Yeah, I think that's right. Once you've got that, in effect, blueprint there, that you know what good leading practice looks like, we always steer clear of that best practice, as we know. You really want to understand how mature you already are across the 5 pillars that you talked about earlier on, Ryan. So, take your architecture and do a maturity assessment so you can see what you've got in your toolkit or your golf bag already today, because the last thing you want to do is go and buy new when you've got something you can reuse and refunction within the environment.
Absolutely agree, yeah.
Particularly if you think about identity, I like to tell people to start with identity when they're doing their Zero Trust, and you may have a good identity solution in place already, and just you might have to add on multi-factor authentication or some other controls to make sure that the identity that's being presented is by the person who owns that identity, as opposed to having a compromised identity. So you've got lots of choices for your identity management solution. It could be Azure AD, it could be Ping, it could be Okta. But one of those tools will help you establish clear identity and authentication.
Oh my God, we get it, identity. Jeez, this guy.
I would actually jump in there that, think about your customer identity as well as not just your enterprise, because lots of people forget that within their digital identity strategy.
Imagine if you were a bank and your customers' identities were compromised. It would be a good thing to establish that the person presenting credentials to the bank as a customer is the person who's the customer. Yes,
absolutely. But Ryan, you have this thing about data classification.
I do have a very big thing about data classification. I think that if you don't know if the data is confidential or public or private, it's very difficult to design a Zero Trust philosophy. If you don't know where your sensitive data is in your organization, or even what that would be. So what you want to do as an organization is make sure that you have a data classification policy. You want to make sure you have the ability to prioritize and control any of the data that's in your environment, and that you can label it and identify where it needs to go and how you want to keep the reins on those sorts of things.
I agree completely. And the reason that I agree is that is where you can prioritize. This is not going to be a big bang. This is going to be a staged implementation, and knowing where your most important assets are is critical to set that plan in place.
Yeah, it's an easier either nut to crack, or if you're eating an elephant, the elephant's a little smaller. If your high sensitive data is only in one, say, environment or one server, then you can focus all your attention on that for year 1 of your implementation. Because remember, this is a journey. It's not a SKU. It's not a product. So it's definitely important to, like you say, prioritize. And really, we're all talking about protecting the data. In one sense, we don't care so much about the device. We want to make sure the data has been protected and remains confidential and secure.
So you mentioned it's not a SKU. There is not one single vendor out there that can actually perform all of this protection information.
That's correct.
Luckily, CBTS has a number of offerings that we have designed around Zero Trust. Whether it's a Zero Trust assessment or roadmap, you mentioned figuring out where you are right now in your maturity, or whether it's some architecture and planning. You want to go through, have our architectures help you figure out your Zero Trust plan. We can do the implementation services for you if you want us to come in and help actually be the hands and feet and do the implementation after you've done the architecture and planning and done the assessment and roadmap. And then, of course, long term, you want to mature those services. You want to mature those the tenets of Zero Trust, and we have managed services that can help you do that as well.
And I think that last point there, Ryan, is really important. Most organizations don't have the scale for 24/7 threat management.
Yep.
And so using an external group is really important for that.
Definitely.
Okay. Thank you.